The officer's expression flickered with something, doubt maybe. But he didn't move to unlock the cuffs. "Then why did your neighbor call this in?" the deputy asked. James let out a bitter laugh. "You tell me. Maybe you should be asking why they thought I didn't belong here." The officer's mouth opened slightly, but he didn't respond. They both knew the answer. A second patrol car pulled up, its headlights cutting through the dimming light. Another deputy stepped out, his posture tense as he approached. "What's going on?" the new officer asked, glancing between them. The first officer hesitated, shifting his stance. "Got a call about a possible theft. He says he lives here." The second officer frowned. "You check his ID." James lifted his cuffed wrists slightly. Didn't get the chance. The new officer gave his partner a look before turning to James. "All right, let's get this straightened out." His tone was more measured, less aggressive. But James had been here before. Just because one officer was willing to listen didn't mean things would go smoothly. Still, he took a breath, holding on to whatever patience he had left. Because this wasn't just about tonight. This was about something bigger, and he wasn't going to let this slide. James stood still, his wrists aching slightly from the handcuffs, but the real pain sat deeper. He had seen this before, too many times. The assumption, the quick judgment. The way people like him were treated as suspects first, no questions asked. His pulse was steady now, his frustration controlled, but a storm brewed inside him. The second officer, a little older, more measured in his approach, stepped closer and studied James for a moment. "You got proof you live here?" James exhaled slowly. "Yes. My wallet's inside the house. I can go get it if you unlock these." He lifted his bound wrists slightly. The first officer shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. The older officer glanced at him before nodding. "Take them off." A hesitation. Then with a click, the cuffs loosened. James rubbed his wrists, biting back the urge to say something sharp. He wasn't free because they suddenly believed him. He was free because someone with more experience had stepped in. "Wait here," the second officer instructed as James stretched his fingers. "I'll go with you." James didn't argue. He led the way toward the house, his boots pressing into the dirt, his heart still pounding. The sky had darkened now, a deep blue stretching over his land. His land. The weight of what had just happened sat heavy in his chest, but there wasn't time to unpack it yet. As he stepped up to the porch, the screen door creaked open. "James." A woman's voice, worried, sharp. His mother. She stood in the doorway, her expression tight with concern. Her eyes flickered to the officer behind him, then to his hands, as if checking for more signs of mistreatment. "What's going on?" she demanded, stepping forward. "Why are the police here?" James met her gaze steady. "Neighbor called in a report. Thought I was stealing from my own farm." His voice was even, controlled, but she could hear the anger beneath it. Her lips pressed together. She knew. Of course she knew. The officer cleared his throat. "We just need to verify his identity, ma'am." His mother scoffed, turning on her heel and disappearing into the house. She was back in seconds, holding James' wallet in her hand. She pushed it toward the officer, her jaw set. "He's lived here his whole life," she said firmly. "Maybe next time you ask before you assume." The officer took the wallet, flipping it open. James didn't say a word as the officer scanned his ID, his brows furrowing slightly as he read. A slow breath, a shift in stance. The name, the military designation, the undeniable proof that James wasn't just some stranger on this land. He was its rightful owner. The officer exhaled through his nose, nodding slightly. "Looks like everything checks out." James crossed his arms. No kidding. The first officer, the one who had cuffed him without a second thought, stood by the patrol car now, silent. He wasn't making eye contact. James wasn't done. So what now? The older officer hesitated, his expression unreadable. We'll let the neighbor know there was a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. That was all it ever was to people like them. A mistake. A miscommunication. Something easy to sweep under the rug. But for James, it was more than that. It was a reminder. James let out a slow breath, glancing past the officers toward the field, stretching out into the night. He had fought for this land, fought for his country, and yet, somehow, he was still fighting to be seen as someone who belonged. The sun was just starting to set over the quiet farmland, casting long shadows across the golden fields. It was the kind of peaceful evening where nothing seemed out of place, until the sound of tires crunching on gravel shattered the calm. A sheriff's deputy, uniform crisp, badge gleaming, pulled up to the entrance of a private farm. His eyes scanned the property, narrowing as he spotted a man near the barn, loading tools into the back of a pickup truck. The man, tall, strong, dressed in work clothes, paused when he noticed the police cruiser. His hands rested on the truck bed, his expression unreadable. He had lived here all his life, knew every inch of this land because it belonged to his family. But something about the way the officer stepped out of his car, hand hovering near his holster, sent a familiar chill down his spine. "Hey, step away from the truck," the officer barked, striding forward with authority. The man raised an eyebrow but didn't move. "This is my truck," he said evenly. "This is my farm." The officer scoffed, glancing at the house in the distance. "We got a report about a suspicious person stealing equipment. Neighbors said they saw someone messing around out here. Show me some ID." There it was. That shift in tone, the unspoken accusation. The man took a slow breath, gripping the edge of the truck to keep himself calm. This wasn't the first time he'd been questioned like this, but it never got easier. "I don't have my wallet on me," he admitted, "but I can go inside and get it. Or you can talk to my family." The deputy's stance stiffened. "Nice try. Hands where I can see them." A knot of frustration tightened in the man's chest. This was his land, his home, and yet he was being treated like a trespasser. The officer's hand was on his radio now, calling something in. Backup, maybe. As if he was a threat. "I'm telling you the truth," the man said, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "I live here." But the officer wasn't listening. Instead, he reached for his cuffs, stepping closer. "Turn around, you're being detained." The man let out a short, incredulous laugh. "For what?" "Suspicion of theft, resisting my orders." Before he could protest further, cold metal snapped around his wrists. He clenched his jaw as the cuffs tightened, his heart pounding. This wasn't just about tonight. It was about every time someone had looked at him and assumed the worst. And that's when it happened. As the officer guided him toward the patrol car, something caught his eye, just barely visible beneath the sleeve of the man's work shirt. A patch of camouflage fabric. A military insignia. The deputy hesitated. His grip on the man's arm loosened ever so slightly. "Wait, you're—" The man turned his head, meeting the officer's gaze dead on. "A soldier," he finished. For the first time, the cop looked uncertain. But the damage was already done. The cuffs were already locked. And now there was no taking it back. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The officer's grip had loosened, but the handcuffs remained tight around the man's wrists. The air between them was thick, charged with something unspoken. The deputy's eyes flickered to the camouflage patch again, his brain catching up to what his instincts had overlooked. "You're military?" he asked, his voice quieter now, edged with hesitation. The man exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. I shouldn't have to tell you that to be treated with respect. The words hung in the air, and for a second, the officer looked like he might say something, maybe even apologize. But the crackle of his radio interrupted the moment. A dispatcher's voice came through, something about a possible suspect being detained. The man shifted his weight, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. He knew exactly how this would play out. The officer wasn't sure what to do now. He had made a mistake, but instead of admitting it, he was stalling, probably waiting for backup to arrive so someone else could deal with it. The man's jaw clenched as he looked out over his land. The same land his family had owned for generations. The same land he had come back to after serving overseas, hoping for some peace. He had done everything right. He had fought for this country. And yet, here he was, standing in handcuffs on his own property, being treated like a criminal. I already told you, the man said, his voice calm but firm. This is my farm. My name is James Carter. My grandfather bought this land in the 60s. My family has lived here ever since. The silence left behind felt heavier than before. James turned to the second officer, his voice steady but cold. This isn't just about a false report. You know that, right? The officer didn't answer right away. His eyes flickered to his partner, then back to James. I know, he said finally, but proving intent is harder than proving a mistake. James shook his head, exhaling sharply. It was always like this. Just enough acknowledgement to move past the situation, but not enough to change anything. Then his mother's voice cut through the night. James, she said, her tone cautious, almost distant. He turned to her, confused. She was staring off toward the side of the barn, her brow furrowed. James followed her gaze, and then he saw it. Tire tracks, fresh ones, leading toward the equipment shed. Tracks that didn't belong to his truck. His stomach tightened. This wasn't just about a false report. Something else had happened here tonight. James felt his breath slow as he stepped toward the tire tracks. His mother was right. These weren't his. Someone had been back here, near the shed, and not long ago. His mind raced. Had the neighbor been snooping around before calling the cops? Had someone else come through, hoping the police would be too distracted with him to notice? The officers must have caught on to the shift in his body language because the second deputy spoke up. Something wrong. James didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved toward the tracks, following them with his eyes. They curved toward the shed, stopped abruptly, then turned back toward the road. Someone had been here. Someone had left in a hurry. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise as he approached the shed door. It was cracked open. That wasn't right. He always made sure it was locked at night. His mother, now standing a few feet away, watched carefully. James, she warned, her voice low. He nodded slightly, then reached for the handle, pushing the door open the rest of the way. Inside, the dim glow of the porch light barely stretched far enough to illuminate the space. But it was enough. Enough to see that some of his tools were missing. Enough to see that a few crates had been dragged out of place. Enough to confirm what his gut had already told him. Someone had actually tried to steal from him. James exhaled sharply, the realization hitting like a punch to the chest. He turned back to the officers. You detained the wrong man tonight. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the anger beneath it. The first officer, the one who had cuffed him without question, shifted uncomfortably. He didn't have a response. The second officer stepped forward, peering into the shed. His brow furrowed as he took in the signs of disturbance. You're saying someone actually broke in. James gestured toward the tracks. Those aren't mine. And that door was locked before I came out here. The officers exchanged a glance. His mother crossed her arms. "So while you were busy arresting my son on his own land, the real thief got away." James turned his head toward the road, his mind spinning. The pieces were falling into place now, clicking together in a way that made his stomach turn. His neighbor had called in a report that James was stealing from himself. But what if that wasn't just about profiling? What if it was a distraction? What if the man hadn't just been trying to get James in trouble? What if he'd been covering for someone else? James looked at the officers again. "You still think this was a misunderstanding?" The second officer frowned. "We need to take a closer look at this." He turned toward his partner. "Call it in." The first officer hesitated for a split second, then reached for his radio. James clenched his jaw, staring down the empty road where the truck had disappeared. They'd wasted time chasing the wrong suspect. But now James had a feeling he knew exactly where they needed to look next. James stood by the shed, his heartbeat steady now, but his mind was racing. The reality of the situation settled in. While he had been in handcuffs, someone had been here, stealing from his farm. And his neighbor? He hadn't just called the cops out of suspicion. No, James was sure now. The man had done it to create a distraction. The first officer, the one who had cuffed him without hesitation, was silent as he relayed the new information over the radio. The second officer walked a slow circle around the shed, shining his flashlight across the tracks. "Looks like they came in fast and left just as quick," he muttered. "Probably didn't expect anyone to notice until morning." James let out a slow breath, glancing back toward the road. Or maybe they thought the cops would be too busy dealing with me to look. His mother nodded, her arms still crossed. And they almost got away with it. James stood still, his arms crossed, eyes locked onto the officer who had cuffed him. The night air was cooler now, but the heat of frustration still burned in his chest. The words "a misunderstanding" echoed in his mind, settling in the pit of his stomach like a stone. That's what they always called it, an excuse to move on without consequences, without accountability. His mother stood beside him, arms folded tightly, her presence steady but tense. She had seen too much of this before, lived through too many moments where assumptions could turn dangerous. Tonight had ended with frustration and humiliation, but it could have been worse. And they both knew it. The second officer handed James his wallet back, his tone careful, measured. "I understand this was upsetting. We'll be reporting back to the caller and making sure they know you're the rightful owner of the property." James took his wallet, slipping it into his pocket. "And what about him?" He nodded toward the first officer, the one who had put him in handcuffs without hesitation. The officer still hadn't looked at him directly, his face unreadable in the dim light. The older deputy hesitated. "We'll discuss it back at the station." James let out a sharp breath through his nose. A non-answer. He expected as much. But he wasn't about to let it go that easily. Before he could speak, the sound of movement from the edge of the property caught his attention. A truck. Headlights flickering between the trees as it slowed near the entrance of the farm. James narrowed his eyes, instincts flaring. "Who's that?" the second officer asked, his body tensing slightly. James shook his head. "I don't know, but I have a feeling." The truck rolled to a stop near the fence, and the driver's door creaked open. A figure stepped out, standing just beyond the reach of the headlights. James took a step forward, his muscles tightening. He had lived here long enough to know most of his neighbors, but something about this felt off. Then the voice came, low, gruff. "I called it in." James exhaled slowly, already knowing before he saw the man's face. One of the older neighbors, a man who had lived nearby for years, but never spoken much to him. James had seen the way he looked at him, at his family, at his farm, as if they didn't belong, as if the land should have never been theirs. The officer turned toward the man. "Sir, this was a false report. Mr. Carter lives here. He owns the property." The man shrugged, his tone casual. Didn't look like he belonged. James clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists at his sides. The words hit hard, not because they were surprising, but because of how easy they were for the man to say, like he wasn't even trying to hide it. The officer sighed, shaking his head. "Sir, you need to leave." But James knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. James locked eyes with a man standing by the truck. His neighbor, the one who had called the cops on him. The one who had watched him grow up on this land, but still chose to believe he didn't belong. The ease with which the man dismissed it all, like calling in a false report, wasn't a big deal, made James' blood run hot. The officer sighed again, stepping toward the neighbor. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the property." But the man didn't move. Instead, he smirked, shifting his weight like he had all the time in the world. "Just looking out for the neighborhood," he said, his voice slow, deliberate. "You can't be too careful these days." James felt his fist tighten again, but he forced himself to breathe. This was exactly what the man wanted, to push, to provoke, to see if James would snap, so he could feel justified in his actions. The first officer, the one who had cuffed him, finally spoke. "Sir, step back into your truck and leave." Now, his voice was firm, but James caught the hesitation in it. Maybe he was finally realizing the weight of his mistake. The neighbor chuckled under his breath, but raised his hands like he was being gracious. All right. No trouble here." He stepped back toward his truck, but his eyes lingered on James, sharp and smug. James knew that look. This wasn't over for him. This wasn't just about tonight. It was about something deeper, something uglier. And it wasn't going away just because the cops told him to leave. Then, just as the man reached for his truck door, he said something under his breath, low enough that only James and his mother could hear. "Should have never been yours to begin with." James' mother took a sharp step forward, her anger breaking through her normally calm exterior. "Excuse me." The man didn't answer. He just climbed into his truck and started the engine, backing away slowly, headlights flashing over the officers before disappearing down the road. The weight of those words settled over them. If James hadn't noticed the tracks, if his mother hadn't pointed them out, this would have ended differently. He would have been left standing here, humiliated, with no proof of anything except a false accusation. And the real criminals would have walked away clean. The officer on the radio looked up. "We'll send a unit to check the neighbor's place." His voice was more careful now, less certain. James could tell he wasn't used to being on the wrong side of a mistake like this. James nodded, but the tightness in his chest didn't ease. He had no doubt in his mind what they would find. Maybe not the stolen tools themselves, but something. A connection. The truth was out now, and it was only a matter of time before the full story unraveled. His mother exhaled and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Let's go inside," she said softly. James hesitated, his eyes lingering on the shed, on the road, on the officers who were finally taking him seriously. But what more could he do tonight? He had already done more than enough. As they walked back toward the house, James glanced over his shoulder one last time. The officers were still there, investigating, talking quietly. It didn't change what had already happened, but at least they were looking in the right direction now. Inside, his mother sat down at the kitchen table, shaking her head. "I'm so tired of this," she admitted, "of having to prove what's already ours." James sat across from her, rubbing his hands together. He knew what she meant. He had left home, served his country, come back to build something for himself. And still, people saw him as an outsider on his own land. But tonight, at least he had turned the narrative around. He wasn't the suspect. He was the one who had exposed the truth. The headlights from the patrol car flashed through the window as one of the officers pulled away. James watched them disappear into the distance, knowing this wasn't over. But this time, he was the one watching.